我喜欢吃米饭。
小红书.
Hello. How do we know stuff about China's military? Like, how is it that I can go on Google and find out the top speed of one of their tanks, or the radar cross-section of their new stealth fighter? I mean, it's not like China and the US met up and swapped technical data on their latest pieces of gear. And while I was wondering this question, I was then serendipitously contacted by two military government officials for, as far as you need to know, look like this. Today, we're going to talk about how we learn about how we get the scoop on China's military, the honestly insane ways that we do, and how that info is used to world build an entirely fake China so that we can fight real China. Great leap forward, the like and subscribe button, and let's talk about it. I recently got a message from a man named via saying how he wanted to talk about how different countries formulate their strategies to prepare for a war against the PRC. Of course, I agreed, and we proceeded to talk for several hours where he and his peers discussed something called the OSINT, a massive database of both good guy stuff and bad guy stuff. I often get flack in the comments because I say good guys and bad guys, but saying pacing threats just doesn't quite have the same ring to it. OSINT stands for Operational Environment Data Integration Network, and in it you can find everything from the size of artillery systems to the fuel capacity of helicopters. The interesting thing is that once you start digging a little more, you might find that all of it is referencing countries you have never heard of, and there is a good reason for that. These countries do not exist. OSINT is part of a database network run by the Five Eyes, that being the United States, Canada, Australia, the UK, and New Zealand, aka all of the white people that speak English. Sorry, Ireland, for being left out of this one. In the world of OSINT, China is not China. It's the People's Republic of Ovana, and even though it is China and everything but the name, we still call it Ovana. Now, obviously, we are not fooling anyone. This isn't us trying to say, oh no, we aren't training to fight China, we're training to fight against a hypothetical Pacific threat. This isn't some form of plausible deniability of our intentions here. Sure, there might be benefits at the surface level, but the real reason might actually surprise you. I wanted to know why we go through the effort of having 5 different countries each staff entire offices that come up with fun facts about fake China, like how they use the caste system in 221 BC, or how Ovana grade school students are good at math. That's right, we made the fake Asian kids good at math. No word if they are good drivers or rude to people when they go on vacation. In order to help me try to wrap my head around this concept, I reached out to Dr. Sarah M. Payne, one of the top officials at the U.S. Naval War College and a leading expert in modern Chinese history and strategy. I asked her what she thought about this whole thing of us putting in all this effort to thinly veil we're training against China, hoping that with her decades of knowledge and experience, she could shed some light on it. She said, "Dear Mr. Taylor, I know nothing about training or gaming." So that was not the response I was hoping for. But when I asked Mr. he said it boiled down to information control, because it lets them fill in gaps of what they don't know. Makes sense, and it allows everything to be unclassified. And that bit had me a little perplexed. Making up a fake country so you can kind of improvise in areas you don't know much about makes sense. The example they gave me was a recent jamming tower the Chinese had shown off in a handful of photographs. We don't know what they're called, and we don't fully know what they're capable of doing, but we do know that they have them. If we have a handful of electronic warfare specialists take a handful of guesses on it, we can have a close enough approximation for your day-to-day training purposes of Americans. But the declassification side of the answer still had me a little confused. Why is it that if we take a Chinese vehicle design, stamp a fake flag on top of the slideshow, and suddenly it's okay to tell everyone that the Type 99 tank is 2.35 meters tall? Well, one reason for that is who is collecting the data here. You've probably heard of the CIA. You know, the people who teamed up with the FBI and your closest family to gang stalk you. But you might not have heard of the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. They're arguably the cooler of the two, because while the CIA was busy hiring the guy at Walmart that collects the shopping carts to fire radio waves into your brain, the DIA was busy snooping around trying to figure out anything and everything foreign militaries are trying to keep secret. They are the ones doing legally questionable things in morally gray areas, all in the name of figuring out what the underside of a J20 smells like. The thing is, though, that everything they do comes with a top secret stamp on the top of the paper. The information they gather is very, very specific, and is used almost exclusively for internal planning purposes that the public will never see. All the battle plans that we have for invading Canada, Greenland, or nuking Uzbekistan all come from information that they have gathered. The things they learn about would do more than just raise a few eyebrows of foreign militaries, because it's literally spying on other people. That information cannot just be handed out to every Private Joe Schmo. However, Private Joe Schmo still has to train to fight somewhat. You can't effectively plan how you're going to approach an objective if you don't know how close you can get before their guns can shoot at you, or how fast the vehicles they have in reserve can go before they counterattack. And that's where the guys that reached out to me come in. Not only are they finding possibly the most creative ways of figuring out what enemy stuff can do, they're figuring out what they can do with it specifically. Funny enough, I think the perfect example to discuss this is this: the humble cargo truck. They wanted to know the answer as to how long a Chinese battalion could fight sustained without any reinforcements or external logistics support. And unless you have a fetish for using a bayonet, your ability to actively fight is based on how much ammo you have. You can look at your standard PLA grunt and assume he's got probably 7-ish mags and maybe an 8th shoved in the old prison wallet. But the majority of a unit's ammo is going to be stored in a crate, and those crates are going to be carried by cargo trucks. Finding out how much the cargo truck could carry was easy enough. With some clever keywords and a sprinkling of Google Translate, they were able to find native language sources reporting that they could carry 5 tons. Seems reasonable enough, but how much ammo does 5 tons get you? They needed to find how much Chinese ammo weighs specifically, at the very least to get an idea of where they're going for. Getting a hold of actual Chinese military ammo is not as easy as it is here in the States or in Russia. It's not like here where you can buy just an entire crate of DoD-made 5.56 on eBay. But getting a hold of loose ammo isn't going to tell the whole story, because rounds are going to be containerized a certain way, and each container is going to take its own amount of size and weight. The office then deployed, I shit you not, what they called weaponized autism. After several days, the most autistic among them, again, their words, not mine, managed to find a full crate on a gray market surplus website based in Kazakhstan. And in the words of the man who inspired the mustache you see today, great success. From there, they were able to visually identify that it was the correct box, crunched some numbers, and figured out that a fully supplied Chinese infantry unit could last 3 days without resupply. Pretty neat, huh? Before I talk about how they actually managed to figure out what information that is probably classified, or at the very least not information China would want out in the open, let's take a second to just appreciate this fake country that they have built of Ovana. For thousands of years, the political climate of Ovana was chaotic to say the least. With such large populations and constant struggling for power, millions perished as groups battled it out for control. That was until the mid-20th century, when definitely not Mao led a communist takeover and united it under a single state. That state is now home to 1.2 billion people, a fifth of the world's population. And in recent decades, the country has adopted a form of state-run capitalism. The Ovanan people have been around since the dawn of civilization. When the Romans weren't busy building aqueducts and putting tiny peepees on statues, the Ovanans were blowing up mountains in order to divert water into favorable directions. They invented gunpowder, have a lot of trains, and entrapped third world nations into mountains of debt using infrastructure projects in order to gain political leverage on port access and natural resources. I feel like I've seen this episode before. Ovana is currently pushing to be the world hegemon, hoping to knock the old US of A down a peg or two. Part of that is having greater influence along the edges of their maritime borders, centered around the territory in the South China Sea. Why is the largest section of ocean off the coast of Ovana called the South China Sea? I don't know. What is this mysterious land of China? No one knows, not even the Ovanans. But they plan to do that through continued military buildup, island fortification, and political saber-rattling that firmly places the actions, specifically of their navy, into a gray zone of operations. They also hire a lot of hackers to conduct constant global operations against every corner of infrastructure, from political, energy production, and defense, to gamers and churches included. They also have a number of bad actors that have caused some internal security issues within the country. Like the Yellow Sashes, who want to establish a monarchy and specialize in sniper assassinations, rockets, and kidnapping. Now that is a real criminal organization. I want to see a Crip try to bracket in a 60mm mortar. Another is the Tantoko Cartel, aka Tantoko Enterprises, that, if you didn't know was a violent underground syndicate, would probably think is a small corporation specializing in green tea imports based on their logo. These guys are actually based out of South Torbia, the date's version of South Korea. If you look at the maps of Torbia and Ovana, you'll notice that Torbia is located in the northern Philippines, with North Torbia centered around Luzon and South Torbia centered around Manila, like the folder. I asked why they did that, because a large portion of how we train to fight on the Korean peninsula is based on the fact that A, it is indeed a peninsula, and B, has horrifically mountainous terrain that also shares a border with China. It turns out at the time, they just happened to have better aerial imagery of the northern Philippines, and that meant that if a bunch of Marines happened to be training on how to fight Best Korea, as if they could ever win, they need good maps and geographic information to have a good training scenario. Imagine how much scarier Kim Jong-un would be if he was Filipino. The last group I'll talk about is known as the Black Society Network, a loosely organized syndicate, with each having names that sound like they belong in a Hideo Kojima game. Interestingly enough, their organization mirrors that of my friend group. But it turns out that much like our own, the vast majority of the information they'd want to know on China/Ovana is just a few Google translated searches away. Chinese companies, much like our own, will often advertise their new stuff, and when the PLA buys said new stuff, we already know what it can do. If you really wanted to spurg out on Ovana, there are dozens of highly detailed videos on tactics, gear, military organization, and strategy, down to the smallest unit tactic all the way up to brigade level formations. I asked how they were able to know this Chinese doctrine because I have yet to stumble upon an official Chinese manual of arms. And the loose answer to that is a mixture of intelligence agency shenanigans, leaked documents, and good old-fashioned guessing. I say guessing, but really for a lot of things, it's not too hard to figure out. If a country like China buys a ton of cheap drones with short ranges, we know they're going to be used at probably the squad level. And if they're used at the squad level, we can assume how they're going to integrate at that echelon based on how they do other things. But a lot of that leans on us knowing how Chinese stuff actually works. The nice thing about a big portion of Chinese equipment is that a lot of it is either a licensed copy of Russian equipment or a copy of someone else's, and a lot of the times America's, and we already know what it can do. One thing I did think was funny was that they said they regularly scan all the same forums and Reddit posts we do. And before you ask, yes, that includes the War Thunder forum. They specifically said that one by name. I've talked a bit before on how and why countries don't bother classifying things, because most of it doesn't matter and keeping it classified makes it a pain in the dick. But that also works in reverse. If all the information we have on Chinese military equipment is classified, then we can't use it for training. If we can't use it for training, then we're back to legitimately just making everything up like we did in the 50s, to the point where we have fake countries we just made up off the back of our head that have fascist communist governments and they all speak Esperanto, and then using tactics that no actual military ever uses. That leaves the unclassified side of military intelligence open to two options. Wait for certain intelligence agencies to consolidate information, break it down to an unclassed level, and then distribute it, which could take years if they even decide to release it, or just do it themselves and go down internet rabbit holes like the rest of us. But ultimately, we use a fake China to prep to fight real China because it just makes things easier, legally at least, to leverage what we know about them against them. But if we wanted to learn the ways of open source information gathering, what are some techniques that you and I could use, us simpletons? Let's take China's Type 99A tank for example. Specifically, we'll look at the armor. We want to find what its protection rating is, using the rolled homogeneous steel metric. This is basically a standardized unit of protection on tanks, because they all use different materials and techniques. Because the Type 99 leverages German-style engines, we can assume what we know about those for size and weight. That size and weight can then be cross-referenced based on still images we have of the tank from open sources. That then can be again cross-referenced with state publications of the inside of the Type 99's turret, and just looking at this autoloader going to town makes me think about how many Chinese tankers are only rocking 8 or 9 fingers right now. Then, using the angles of the armor along with the internal space required for the gun itself, we can get a rough approximation of how thick the actual hull armor is, which comes out to somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 millimeters equivalent of homogeneous rolled steel. Or we can just look at this one interview where a Chinese tanker slipped up and said it was slightly over 1,000. As a wise man once said, there are many paths up the one mountain. However, some ways are a gondola ride and others are scaling cliffs with your bare hands. What I quickly learned talking to these guys is that each bit of information has its own little story. There isn't necessarily a step-by-step guide on gaining the penetration info for the PLA's 125 Sabo round. It's a random leak here, a blurry image there, and the occasional Kazakh man with a box of illegal ammo sitting in the corner of his yurt. And to me, that just makes the entire process more interesting. Before I go, I want to thank the anonymous people who reached out to me to help this video. You know who you are? You're probably watching right now. They did ask for me to keep them anonymous and not show their faces or names, so I will abide by their wishes, but I have linked all of their work down in the description so you too can check it out. And if you're like me, it's an insane rabbit hole of information and really cool stuff that's fun to learn about. And on that note, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.